We come to section 11. I look at this and my heart sinks, because I know that I cannot possibly convey in the space of one or even two sessions the 10th part of what this contains, or probably even the 100th part of what it means to me. Geoffrey was saying the other day, when he was talking about the spiritualistic phenomena, that he thought he was doing the subject a disservice merely by skimming over the surface of it. And I know exactly how he felt. Merely to present the ideas in this particular section in this rather distilled form that you have it here, in no way will convey the breadth, depth, warmth of the picture painted in The Secret Doctrine and the other literature. So I can only say that this is fingers pointing at the moon, and don't look at my finger, please. Look at the moon. We'll start by going through the numbered paragraphs until I get caught in some sort of tangent and disappear off on my own in some way, but at least we'll start on the right track and we'll see what becomes of it. 11.1 on page 40 is nothing more than a restatement of principles that we have now covered, that the second of these three schemes of evolution can only commence in earnest when the physical scheme has reached a certain point of development. As the Mahatma says in one of his letters, the development of mind is a slower and more difficult evolution, and can only take place within the matrix or context of the at least partially developed physical form. The brain, as we have seen before, is an essential ingredient in this process. However, we won't dwell on that today. The point made in 11.2, section 11.2, again we have talked about before, and that is the idea that it takes one planetary round, broadly speaking, to develop one of the 7 principles in our Constitution, remembering always that aspects of each principle will be developed in the minor cycles within that round. So this is just a broad statement. But we restate it here because we are coming to the evolution and development of mind. We may say that the first 3 rounds would have been broadly concerned with the 3 lower principles, what are sometimes referred to as the physical triad. That is behind us, so in the 4th and 5th rounds we shall be primarily concerned with the evolution of the 4th and 5th principles in our Constitution, with karma and with manas. Now, it is stated as such that left to its own devices, the cyclic process would not have developed the 5th principle in us until the 5th round. However, what we're going to talk about extensively today and probably tomorrow is going to be about the hierarchy of creative powers, the Dhyan Chohans, the Manasaputras, who have accelerated that process and have endowed us with mind at an earlier stage in our development. Now, this is stated in the passages I've quoted in 11.2 on page 119. The first of those paragraphs we need not read, I think, in detail. But the second one does add something to this, and I would like to draw your attention to it. The second of the two quoted at under 11.2, it says, "It is only in the actual midway round," that will be the 4th of course, "that he, that man, develops in himself entirely the 4th principle as a fit vehicle for the 5th. So here we see this sort of pyramidical or cumulative structure, and not until the 4th is developed, never mind just the physical principles, but the fourth as well, can the fifth, the mind, begin to its evolution. And then it goes on to say that to a degree it will be developed in the fourth, but in full only in the corresponding round, the fifth. This idea about it requiring the fourth principle is stated in another passage I've quoted later on, which I expect we'll come to, in words of the stanzas, at the point in which the dhyanis, so to speak, incarnate in man, they are said to intensify the karma. That's the phrase used in the stanzas. Intensify. It's an interesting thought, isn't it? It requires that. You cannot activate mind, switch it on, so to speak, without focusing it in and through this fourth principle. So we might well ask ourselves, how is it that the fourth principle gets to the point where it can sustain a mind evolution, a thinking conscious entity? And a fascinating insight is given us in this in the passage I've quoted you at the bottom of page 119. This comes from the Mahatma Letters. The first part of this is interesting in its own right, and this is my first disappearing off at a slight tangent. Volition and consciousness are at the same time self-determining and determined by causes. When I reread this recently, I thought that this was saying exactly the same as that phrase that Joy had quoted from the Matrix of Mystery when it said man is both the encoder and the encodement. Yes? Consciousness is self-determining, in other words, it's inherent within us, and is determined by causes external to us. And in this, you might say, the whole thorny question of free will and determinism is encapsulated. The truth of the matter is that we neither have complete free will nor are we completely determined, but it is a mixture of the two. Both self-determining free will and determined, decided by causes, presumably external determinism. But what is so determined? Well, volition and consciousness are the very essence of what we feel ourselves to be, after all. Volition, will, desire, and indeed would no doubt be included in volition here. Well, that I suggest you think about, if you will. So all of those are determined by causes, and the volition of man, his intelligence and consciousness, will awake, but when his fourth principle, karma, is matured and completed by its seriatim meaning serial, one after another, seriatim contact with the karmas, or energizing forces, of all the forms man has passed through in his three previous rounds. Now, you remember that we've talked about this business, that before we have achieved human form, physical form, we have had to experience life in the forms of the three lower kingdoms, mineral, plant, and animal, admittedly in earlier rounds and in different degrees, but nonetheless we have done so. And here you're being told why, or one of the benefits of having done that, by having experienced the karma, the energizing forces. It's an interesting, it's a very suggestive passage, and from that, the karma energy that we feel within us, the volitional energy, has now been matured, has come to fruit. We are now capable of expressing ourselves in that fourth mode. And having done that, now the fifth principle, this self-conscious mode, can express itself in that by, in the words of the stanza, by intensifying it. And is this not exactly how we see it? That what we call emotion and desire and so forth is just that, mind intensified. If it were not for mind, would it be the way it is? Would it perhaps not be rather more neutral than the way we perceive it to be? Moving on then to 11.3. we start our look at the class of beings who are collectively responsible, who is collectively responsible for awakening mind in man. Now, the way it is presented in anthropogenesis, in the secret doctrine, this process or event is associated with the development of man in his third root race, his third stage of development. And without a more close look at the subject, you might think that this is the first time that it's occurred. But the implication strongly is that this awakening of mind has been happening cumulatively and at relatively the same point in a whole series of cycles up to the point that we're now discussing, that of the fourth globe in the fourth round. The passage that I've actually quoted here, and I think I've mentioned it once or twice before, in the Mahatma letters, it says, in the second round, he becomes responsible in a degree, to a degree. In the third, he becomes so entirely. Now, any being who is responsible must have choice and some degree of discrimination, and that can only arise from the development of mind. The lower kingdoms are said not to have this, and therefore not to be in any sense responsible, generating karmic results as we do. So, the strong inference is that whoever it is, or whatever it is, that is responsible for awakening mind in us has been at work for some while. However, it is true to say that here in this fourth round, where we currently are, because of the development of the fourth principle, just because of that, and also the refining of the physical body and the brain and the nervous system and senses, that it is much more receptive to this impress or enlivening, intensifying, and that we will see reflected later on as well. So, a gradual process, but the events described in the third race are critical. 11.4 we, I think, can bypass in this context. Moving on to 11.5. Or I think we can probably skip 11.5 too. We'll have a quick race through that and have a look at 11.6. Yeah, well, we've recapitulated all that. The notes in 11.6, the paragraph says, at the midpoint of the third race, the process of recapitulation of the physical scheme was sufficiently complete to have developed a responsive physical, or accurately astral, form. Now the dhyanis could act. Now in this cycle they could carry out their function. And you see that there are reflections of the point at which this occurs. It is significant that it is in the third race, the third of 7. Just as in the third of 7 rounds man became, as the Mahatma said, entirely responsible, just as we in the third cycle of our incarnations are said to become entirely responsible. So the third is significant here. Who are these beings, these dhyanis who endow us with mind? Well, we have to, in a broad sense, met them before when we looked at chapter 5 in the book, where we discussed the hierarchies of beings. I introduced you to the 12 hierarchies of creative powers described in the commentaries on Sloka 1 of stanza 7. And we saw there that of the lower 7, the fifth in a descending sequence, the fifth hierarchy of creative powers, was concerned with the evolution of mind in man. And on a still more specific scale, there are said to be 7 much more specific hierarchies concerned with the evolution of our 7 principles, an inner 3 and an outer 4. And the inner 3 are those that she refers to as the Agnishvata Pitris, who are the originators of our mind. Now, all of these terms and so forth come from and are drawn from different traditions. And Madame Blavatsky, in her eclectic manner, has drawn on all of these and picked out just which ones suited her fancy and used them in a meaning of her own as it distresses the scholars who find that when she uses terms as she wants them, like Alice or like Humpty Dumpty, just uses them in the way that she wants to use them. And we shall see this again and again as we look through this. However, it is with these Agnishvata Pitris, these Manasaputras and the like that we are here now concerned. They are, I've suggested, and I've used this phrase repeatedly, representatives of the fifth creative hierarchy. They are not that fifth creative hierarchy in its fullness. I think that is far greater than the representatives who are concerned with stimulating mental evolution in us. But they are part of that group. Is there anything I wanted to say about that? I have given you a list on page 121 of the many names used in the Mahatma letters. I just had a brief count through. I've actually quoted 23 here. Joy, you told me that there were...
I counted 30.
30, yes. Well, Barborka, I think, has got even more. If you look in the Divine Plan, he's got a whole page full. Yeah. So it's quite a confusing topic if you come to this for the first time, and it looks like you've got about 30 different groups all actively involved in the evolution of mind in man. Well, it's not so, and perhaps the notes that I've given you on page 121 might help in that respect. It's really only, again, a pointer, nothing more than that. Now, the crucial passage, as far as this is concerned, is 11.7. Whereas I have said in that paragraph, simply stated, they incarnate in man and become the egos of mankind. But as I say there, the problem is not so simply covered. Far from it. This is the whole central mystery and problem of anthropogenesis. To my way of thinking, there is no more crucial or important factor than just this momentous process. Well, I hesitate to say event because that rather implies it happened all at once. Process of the incarnation of these dhyanis in the third race underlies so much, to the extent that we can understand psychologically what is happening here and just who is who in this drama. So it leads us to some very fascinating insights into our own character and constitution right now. And that, I'm perfectly sure, is why we've been given this information. Now, in order to understand what it means by incarnating in man, we have to a degree to look at who incarnates and in whom they incarnate. There are two parts to this process. In whom they incarnate first. In looking at the story so far, what we saw yesterday and the day before in the physical scheme, we had seen that there were three broad classes of mankind at this point. The most advanced monads of class 1, the Lunapitris, those who had evolved the shadows, the bodies, for those who came behind. And then we saw that there was the average humanity of classes 2, 3 and 4. It is with these that the following drama will now occur. As far as the laggards are concerned, they are not involved in the incarnation of the dhyanis. So for the moment, we can set those aside. So we have a spectrum of human monads incarnated in presumably a spectrum of human form at that point. Still an astral race at this stage. Then we have to consider who are these incarnating dhyanis? Well, there are a number of passages where she indicates something of the nature of these incarnating dhyanis. And these I want to consider in conjunction with the crucial sloka or stanza wherein this is described. And just because I haven't got my finger on it, of course it immediately disappears. On page 127 in paragraph 11.12, in the beautiful words of the sloka, there's real magic in these slokas, real magic. The sons of wisdom, the sons of night. Well, we've talked about this business about the four bodies of Brahma and the sons of night and the sons of twilight. And again, she has chosen to use this terminology here. The sons of wisdom, ready for rebirth, came down. They saw the intellectually vile forms of the first third of the third race, still senseless, unconscious. She's using the word senseless here in the way unconscious. Saw these intellectually disagreeable forms. We can choose, said the lords. We have wisdom. As indeed they have. They are mind-born sons. They have discrimination. No, I don't imagine for a single instant that dhyanis wandered around looking at the bodies saying, ugh. And don't fancy that one. And it wasn't some sort of cattle market going on here. This is a metaphor, obviously, for the appreciation. Some entered the chayas. Now, you remember we talked about this term chayas yesterday. These are the shadows. Even now, still in the third race, we still are referring to them as chayas, shadows. And I think what Joy was saying this morning, quoting from Sloka 7 of stanza 7, "Thou art my Vahan, my image and my shadow," again has direct bearing on the meaning of the use of the word shadow here. Some entered the shadows. This is, after all that physical man is represented by at the moment, a shadow. Some entered the shadows, and we shall have to discuss what is meant by entered. Some projected a spark. Some deferred till the fourth race. So three classes, three modes of action on the part of the incarnating dhyanis. From their own rupa, they filled or intensified the karma, which we've talked about before. Those who entered became arhats, and that again we will need to look at. That's the first and highest class. Those who received but a spark, that's the second category, remained destitute, remained without higher knowledge. In other words, the full higher mind did not burn in that second category, which by inference means that in the first class, those in whom they entered, it did just that. The spark burned brightly, you might say, in the first class. Well, the third lost out for a while, but we shall see what happened to those a little later on. Now, that lays out the broad pattern, but we have to consider what is meant by this term entered. Now, we can look at this in a number of ways, but there are a whole series of passages in Anthropogenesis primarily, but in other places as well, where the meaning of the action undertaken by these dhyanis is spelled out for us. And as I've already said once, and I should be saying again more than once, they become the egos of mankind. Now, this is an extremely startling statement when you stop to think about it. We are relatively happy to go along with the idea that the body is external to what we feel ourselves to be, despite all the warnings and caveats that I and Joy have entered on this about I am not my body. Nonetheless, we're relatively happy to go along with the idea that the body is not essential to what we feel ourselves to be, and that at death we can drop the body off and let it go, and we're something else, that's okay. We'll get another body at the next incarnation, so that's fine. But if I now tell you, or as it says here, that you're not even the ego, you get a bit worried now, because that's what you do feel yourself to be. Excuse me, you say, but this is me, here I am. And it's this whole quality of I am I, the sense of identity, finding out who you are, which is, you feel, the essential ingredient. Most of the rest you're relatively happy to let go, but identity, no, not too happy to let go of that. But that's just exactly what we have to come to terms with in understanding this doctrine that is being put forth here. And that is why on page 121 and onward I have quoted just so many instances of this particular doctrine. I have stressed here the identity of the human ego with the incarnating Dharani is very important. And I've just given you a few extracts where exactly these words are used. The first one, the archaic commentaries explain that of the host of Dhyanis whose turn it was to incarnate as the egos. You see this phrase, incarnate as the egos. Not to overshadow, not to awaken something in, but incarnate as the egos. And it's exactly this specific phrase which is used repeatedly. In the second extract on page 122, exactly the same phrase occurs about 5 lines down. But the true esoteric meaning is that most of them, the Dhyanis in this case, were destined to incarnate as the egos of the forthcoming crop of mankind. And the third one says exactly the same, in effect. The esoteric philosophy identifies, again it's these strong phrases, it's all these things about the doctrine preaches that. In this case the esoteric doctrine identifies which gives a series of names, identifies them with the egos, which by incarnating in the still senseless man of the third race made him consciously immortal. So you see just what an extraordinary thought this is. It's not just there in the secret doctrine, notice. The last one I've given you comes from the Key, which is supposed to be an introductory book. Yeah, it's supposed to introduce you to these things easily, but admittedly from a footnote, but nonetheless it's still there in the Key. All our egos are thinking and rational entities, manasaputras, who had lived, whether under human or other form, in the preceding life cycle, and whose karma it was to incarnate in the man of this one.
But does that not mean that we are they?
Indeed, indeed. Now I shall leave you to think about that for 5 minutes. Okay, gang.
Are you speaking to the Dhyanis here?
Nothing is mine.
Very little. Very little.
I would say.
The collection. See, whatever we had collect by ourselves, right?
Mm-hmm.
Nothing is just the same all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, there are no evolution.
This is true. This is true. But you see, this does rather pull the rug out from under you, doesn't you? You've been studying all of this up till now, and you've been talking about the human life wave, and we've followed it religiously through the arrival in the first round, and we've followed it cyclically all down the globes, and here comes the human monad. And then suddenly we find out that what we feel is essentially ourselves, I, ego, came from somewhere else altogether. And it wasn't that at all. Very puzzling. Who was it that made, well, it was the monad. It was the monad that made the journey. It's yes, indeed, indeed.
Where did they enter?
Where, or how do you mean where?
Into the human monad or into actual?
Ah, she might have set the question up for me. Thank you, Erica. Thank you, Erica. Excellent. Good question. As the teachers are prone to say, I'm glad you asked me that. The question that you ask, where do they enter, how do they enter, one might say, is, of course, excuse me, central to just what it is that they do, and without regard for whichever class that we might talk about and whether we're higher or lower or inferior or superior, just exactly what they do, I suggest, is crucial to this whole question. Now, there is a passage which I have actually quoted in here, but you might as well, seeing as you've all got your secret doctrines, you might as well look at in the original, which is emblazoned in my mind. How could I possibly forget it? In volume 2, page 167.
Two.
167 in the original edition.
Yeah.
Which one is it? In
174 of ADR number 3.
Seeing as this is such an important passage, we'll look at it in the original rather than in my digested or extracted form, because I think it's important that we spend some time on it. If you wish to look at it in my digested form, it's on page 123 in my book, in paragraph 11.8, where the essence of the thing is extracted. She says in 167, this whole large paragraph is concerned with this. We come now to an important point with regard to the double evolution of the human race. Double evolution? Physical and intellectual. The sons of wisdom, or the spiritual dhyanis, as opposed to the parishad or physical dhyanis, or relatively physical, the sons of wisdom had become intellectual through their contact with matter, because they had already reached, during previous cycles of incarnation, that degree of intellect which enabled them to become independent and self-conscious entities on this plane of matter. Now, that passage that Joy read you out this morning has direct relationship to this. You remember that passage that she read you from Collected Writings 6, where she told you about the fate of those who had graduated from a previous cycle and had won their freedom to rove, what was it? To rove in the interstellar space, and who at the next solar manvantara would have to overshadow the ego of another humanity. Well, that's the future, and these are they from the past, having done exactly the same in some past manvantara, and having gone through their solar pralaya, and now they wake up. They were the graduate humanity, you may say, of some long-dead chain. Now they have to perform that service for us. They were reborn only by reason of karmic effects. Well, that's a statement redolent with meaning, but she doesn't elaborate what the karmic effects were. Just, one would suppose, the whole cyclic process. They entered those who were ready and became the arhats or sages alluded to above. Well, I've read you Sloka 24, where it says they entered those who were ready and they became the arhats, and that is a reference back to the Sloka. This needs explanation, she says. Dead right, it does. It certainly needs explanation. It does not mean that monads, now notice that she has italicized monads. It does not mean that monads entered forms in which other monads already were. Now, this is what perhaps you might have thought was the case. After all, we have been following the evolution of the human monad, and we had got as far as, in the third race, the monad overshadowing or dwelling in a physical or semi-physical form. And now we're told along comes somebody else and becomes your ego. So you might well have thought that you now had one form with a human monad in it, another dhyani monad in it, endowing it with an ego. But that is what she's saying is not the case. Just exactly not the case. Now, if you want the essence of what she's going to say, then you can skip, if you will, the next sentence or so, as I have done in the passage that I have extracted. She goes on to explain something about their nature and says that about them being essences and intelligences. We'll come back to that in a minute, but I'd like you to move down, 2 sentences and about 6-7 lines, where it says the monads are not discrete principles. Do you see that? The monads are not discrete principles. Now, Joy's already told you about the meaning of discrete. It doesn't mean that they had let loose some indiscreet secrets or something. Discrete, separate, individual. They are not discrete principles, limited or conditioned. No, indeed. The whole nature of monad isn't in any sense separable, individualized. Although for convenience we talk about the human monads in the plural, this is only a verbal convenience. You remember that beautiful passage which we've quoted more than once, lift thy head, O Lanu, what dost thou see burning in the dark midnight sky? I sense one flame, O Gurudeva. I see countless undetached sparks in it. Paradox. Of course, paradox. There is but one flame. The human life wave is one flame in which countless undetached, inseparable sparks burn. So here, the monads are not separate in any sense. The monads are not discrete principles, limited or conditioned, but rays from that one universal absolute principle. So you get this again, this sort of sunburst picture of rays emanating from a central sun. And just as you cannot distinguish one ray of sunlight from another, although you may say that the ray of sunlight which falls on a particular object illuminates that object, it wasn't the sun's purpose to illuminate that object. It just happened to be that the universally diffused radiance happens to fall on that particular object. And the object might say, aha, here is my sunbeam. But of course, it was never anybody's intention to make it your sunbeam any more than it was anybody's intention to make it your monad. And then she uses this rather intriguing analogy. She says the entrance into a dark room through the same aperture, the same hole, the same gap, the same aperture of, through the same aperture of one ray of sunlight following another will not constitute 2 rays, but 1 ray intensified. And this is the analogy. It's not 2 monads, externally and separately, individually focusing their action into one physical form, but it is 2 rays from the central sun, which, so to speak, one intensifies the other. And the light in the darkened room becomes brighter as a result of the intensifying, vivifying action of this second monadic influence which is now felt within it. So if we ask how did these dhyanis do this, it is in this way. Now, seeing as what we feel ourselves to be is entirely within this darkened room, you and I and what we feel ourselves to be are within that darkened room, and we don't know what's going on outside it. We don't perceive it as 2 rays at all. You're inside the darkened room. What do you see? 1 ray. Whatever you feel yourself to be in the most deep and fundamental level, consciousness, monad, spiritual, whatever, is just that, the 1 ray. But it has been enriched by the presence of the dhyani. And in that enrichment, in that enriching process, is made possible the development of ego as we understand and feel it to be. But ego is a very specific development within the human context. You see, it says they become the egos of mankind. It doesn't say that they were egos previously. There's a very subtle distinction here. It says they become the egos of mankind. It is the very action of focusing their intensified quality, especially within initially this psychophysical organism that we feel ourselves to be now, that they become the egos of mankind.
So they don't remain themselves, or do they remain on their own level still?
Well, herein lies another story as well. There's different stories and different perspectives on this, and I think we have to be extremely careful about how we perceive the state of being of these dhyanis as independent of ourselves. There are passages which I have quoted in the book. Such as on page 122, at the very bottom, which seem clear enough. It says, to do this, that is, I have interpolated there, incarnate in man. To do this, they had to give up their natural status and, descending on our globe, take up their abode on it for the whole cycle of the Mahayuga, thus exchanging their impersonal individualities, their native mode of being, you might say, for individual personalities, you and I. The bliss of sidereal existence for the curse of terrestrial life. So that would imply, would it not, that they have lost something, they had to give up. One would perhaps read into that they are here, they are me, I am they, however you want to put it. This is it. I, the dhyani, speak. In a very real extent, it is nowhere else. And yet, as it says on the very next page in another passage which I've extracted and wrestled with for years, I might say, it says, many are those among the spiritual entities, on the next page, 1, 2, 3, just turn over one page, top paragraph. Many are those among the spiritual entities who have incarnated bodily in man since the beginning of his appearance, and who, for all that, still exist as independently as they did before in the infinitudes of space. To put it more clearly, which is kind to us, to put it more clearly, the individual entity may be bodily present on Earth, without abandoning, however, its status and functions in the supersensuous regions.
Adam. Pure Land story you told us this morning.
I believe it is.
Follow first and
I believe it is, yes, and I think this is also in the Trikaya doctrine, and it's also illustrated in a section in volume 5 where Madame Blavatsky gives them 2 chapters on the nature of the Buddha, on the mystery of the Buddha, I think the section is. And she says, in effect, I very much doubt you're going to understand what I'm about to tell you, but I'll try, and tries to go into this business about how it's possible that the Buddha can both be physically and bodily present and still exist in other states of being at one and the same time. But there is something in this. Yes, Edita.
It's possible that this is what originates the duality that we have to fight through life.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
What duality do you mean?
The duality of the divinity
Certainly.
and the
Certainly.
no evolutionated.
This whole struggle which goes on within us between the personal and the individual, between the material and the divine, is just because of this. If it were not for the incarnation of the dhyani within us, there would be no struggle at all. There would be no consciousness, there would be no mind, there would be no problem at all. And the whole, the whole of it, we would have gone, as HBB says in one place, we would have gone through it half unconscious. But just because they have awakened within us the consciousness of the divine possibilities within man. Just because of that, there is now a struggle that we feel the whole time between, putting it metaphysically, the pull of matter and the indwelling, the pull of the spiritual pole within us.
And that is why the ego wants this inferior part, let me put it somewhere, way, this inferior part develop itself into an ego.
Mm-hmm.
The other ego disappear, or what's happened there?
I don't think it's a problem we need worry about too much, because it's not going to happen. It's not going to be a problem until we get to the end of this whole cycle in the seventh race and the seventh round, as she puts it. And then what Joy read out this morning will happen also to us. We will have become, insofar as we succeed, a graduate humanity. We will, as Diane Chohans, be self-conscious, independent entities in our own right. We will have inherent within us developed mind, so that we need no help, in that respect anyway, from any other class of beings. They will have lit the fire to such an extent that it is now self-sustaining fire.
I see.
I thought of a very crude analogy of that years ago. Years ago, we used to light coal fires with a device which blew hot air into it. If you took the blower out too soon, the fire went out. Yeah. But if you left it in there for about 10 or 15 minutes, it became a self-sustaining fire. And I likened the action of what's going on here to that hot air that they were blowing into. We blew into the fire. If you took it out too soon, the fire would go out. If the dhyani were to withdraw its influence now, we would not have enough within us to sustain a sense of ego. There would not be enough mind function left for us to build ego structures with, and therefore we would fall back into a relatively unconscious, mindless state. But because they will maintain that presence and influence within us throughout the whole cycle of our evolution, by the time we get to the end of it in the seventh race, in the seventh round, the fire will have been well and truly lit and now couldn't go out. And when they withdraw, in whatever sense they withdraw from us, we will be self-sustaining, self-conscious entities operating in the same world as they. This is my look at the thing.
At the higher monastic level, self-conscious.
Yes, I believe so. Leonard, sorry.
I would suggest as an alternative, but I think yours is the better one, the idea of a catalyst. Probably the idea is better.
Yes, a catalyst, certainly they are, enabling a reaction, in the sense that we use a catalyst in a chemical situation. They enable a reaction to occur in just the same way. They are providing the environment in which exactly the psychological reaction can occur, and we can build the psychic content of our experience. The one or two other analogies that I could put before you, some of which I've used before, as to how we might view this also. One which rather appeals to me, you may think a little fanciful, is the idea that the dhyanis, as looked at from the dhyani's point of view, the incarnating dhyani, how does he feel when he has to underpin the whole man and exchange, as they say, his impersonal individuality for personal individual personalities? How does he feel about the whole thing? Well, remembering the nature of these Dhyan Chohans as creative hierarchies, do you remember the description that was given of the Lipika? I'm not suggesting that these beings are Lipika by any manner of means, but the process involved, I think, is a similar one. Now, the key phrase, which I always remember from that passage about the description of the Lipika, is that they project into objectivity the passive content of the universal mind. It's a slight paraphrase, but that's what it is. Their whole creative action has been to imagine the universe, to use it, to put it in a more poetic way. They have, in another way, dreamt the universe into existence. Supposing it was that the dhyanis dream us, and that what has happened is that they have focused their attention, so to speak, on an individual human being, to the extent that they see through our eyes, they experience through our senses, they live through our consciousness, but that is all enriched by their psychic content, and it is their dream, so to speak, that it is that is our physical waking consciousness. How's that for an image? And while they're the analogy is it goes a little further, because just as to us the dreaming is relatively unreal, whereas the waking, we say, is the greater reality, perhaps for them too their waking state is as it was before, and their dreaming state is as it is involved with man. And insofar as that they underpin the whole of our states of mental consciousness, it is an extended dream for them throughout this whole process.
But isn't it awful we can't both be awake together?
Yes,
We can't shake
it is
hands.
sad. It is sad, isn't
And
it?
make friends and
Do you think this business of their dreaming us has anything to do with what HPB says about our ego becoming awake when we are asleep?
I do. I hadn't really proposed to get round to that tomorrow, but till tomorrow. But I'll say very much more about that tomorrow. And I think that is exactly central to this whole idea, and it's partly where I got this idea of it being a dream. I mean, it is said that our ego wakes up when we sleep.
See, because the passage you also read yesterday, they are independent jhanis.
Oh,
Yes,
I see.
indeed. So that's one way. That's one little image that I had looked on here, a dreaming. Another way which also occurred to me is perhaps even more fanciful, which I think I used when I was out in Canada. Imagine, if you will, that the use of a remote control camera. Supposing that you have more than that, supposing you have a very cleverly constructed robot, such as they explore the bottoms of oceans or the surface of the moon and so forth, and sitting in a control station somewhere, there is a human operator who sees on a console through the eyes of the remote controlled device, and through controls can move it around and so forth from one place and another. Now imagine, as indeed I'm sure is the case, that as far as the operator is concerned, he needs to give his whole attention to that device that he is remotely controlling. And to the extent that he gives his whole attention to it, its claws and mechanical arms become his arms, its television eyes become his eyes, and whatever other sensory equipment is becomes his sensory equipment. And for that time being, he has animated the remote control device, which then walks about and represents him in that particular environment in which he cannot go. Suppose it were that our whole psychophysical organism was some such remote control device, and that sitting within it is the Manasaputra, who during waking existence is wholly identified with it and lives through our limbs and looks through our eyes and speaks through our mouth and thinks through our thought processes. Well, it's just an analogy. It's just it's just an image that you might like to consider. I don't suggest you take it wholly literally, because I don't think it is wholly true. But I think there are elements in it which you might like to consider.
And remember too that they have a period of time, I hate to say period of time, but of compassionated, to put in practice the compassion. It's a compassion to be in our side, in our, helping us all the time.
That's true. That's true as well.
what is then the function of man to give them experience?
It's purely cooperative. Both benefit from the experience. it's made very clear that we represent an opportunity for a higher order humanity than they were within their development as a humanity. As we saw, who was it this morning who was saying that the child is always superior to its parent and looked at in this process? We as a child humanity are therefore superior to the humanity which would have preceded us. As a humanity, they are certainly our superiors in terms of having developed faculty which we do not yet possess. But as a humanity, we are their superiors, just as those who will succeed us will be our superiors as well. Therefore, there is much that they can learn by sharing in our human experience. So therefore, for them it's of benefit. But equally, of course, it's vastly of benefit for us to be able to wake up to self-consciousness far sooner than we would have done left to our own rather tediously slow devices. So I suggest that both benefit from it. It's a handshake.
Yes, it must be so. On the other hand, we hear that they must have passed through a humanity stage previously.
Yes.
So how this humanity can be superior in some way?
Only in comparison, retrospective comparison. All that we're saying is that this one now is superior to that one then.
Because you're going to have this and the then one as well.
Correct. Yes. Progressive, developmental. It must be so. That each successive humanity is of a higher order, capable of developing more faculty, more function, more consciousness, and so forth. So that's wherein they get their benefit, it seems. I mean, it is a task that they have to perform, and it's something from which they get benefit.
You also get the karmic consequences.
Oh, indeed. Perhaps we could move on just a little bit now and consider something of the nature of these incarnating dhyanis from the passages which I have quoted you here, because this in itself is instructive. We've seen from the sloka that some entered, some projected a spark, some deferred till later in the cycle, the fourth race. But I'd like to draw your attention to some of the statements which are said about who these entities are. Now, it was considerable insight to me of what Joy read out this morning from Collected Writings 6, and fitted in and enhanced a picture which some of the passages that I'm going to read you now all depict anyway. But let's have a look at those.
What page?
Well, the first one that I'm going to look at is on page 125. One order of the beings which incarnate and awaken mind in man, HBB uses the term Nirmanakaya to describe. Now, this is where she uses these terms, I suggest, rather differently from their classical Buddhistic terminology, although there will certainly be echoes of the same meaning. Just because she's using it in a different way, I have given you her definition. On page 124, I've quoted you a passage from the Key. The term Nirmanakaya is described as, she says, it is the name given to those who, though they have won their right to nirvana and cyclic rest, have out of pity for mankind and those they have left on earth renounced the nirvanic state. And goes on to describe how it remains within the astral aura of the globe, and although not necessarily physically embodied, overshadows and helps out in the subsequent evolution of the world. Now, I mentioned that because when talking of these classes of incarnating dhyanis, as you can see at the top of 125, it says, but later on as Nirmanakayas, they, that's the incarnating dhyanis, sacrificed themselves for the good and salvation of the monads which were waiting for their turn, and which otherwise would have had to linger for countless ages in irresponsible, animal-like, though in appearance, human forms. See, this was the point that I was making at the beginning here, that it really is not in the sequence of natural law that until the fifth round that we would have developed mind. But it is out of compassion for mankind that this particular group have carried out this function and awoken mind in man. Now, For them, it was sacrifice. They didn't have to do it, it seems. But they did, and had to go through the processes that we've already described. So I have made the suggestion in here that they represent the highest group associated with the highest within the purely human kingdom. They, as in the words of the slokas, those in whom they entered became the arhats referred to. The thus illumined human being, who would have been previously presumably one of the lunar Pitris, the Bahishad Pitris, the class 1 human monads, who were already self-conscious entities to a degree anyway, and with the full light now of the wisdom and consciousness of this dhyani underpinning it, now become the full expression. They became the arhats and sages referred to, and they have a subsequent function to fulfill, which we may or may not get round to talking about today. Others she refers to as returning nirvanis. And in the second passage on 125, if the reader were told in the semi-esoteric allegories that these beings were returning nirvanis, so semi-esoteric allegories, it's not quite like that. It's an allegory in the first place. It's only semi-esoteric, so that means it's semi-exoteric as well. And this has therefore to be read with, if you like, a pinch of salt, but where you need to pinch the salt is never quite terribly clear here. That these beings were returning nirvanis from preceding Mahamanvantara. Now this is where what Joy was saying this morning is so interesting. The Mahamanvantara here would indicate the solar Manvantara, I would guess, and therefore from a previous solar Manvantara. Ages of incalculable duration which had rolled away in eternity, a still more incalculable time ago. If he was told all this, he would hardly understand the text correctly. Well, there's generous of her. While some Vedantins might say it's not possible anyway, the Nirvani never returns. And she says, well, true within the Manvantara in which he is incarnated, but not true in the bigger picture. So some of them then are paraphrasing that completely. The graduate humanity of a previous life cycle, whose function it is now, having enjoyed their freedom for a while and undergone their solar pralaya, now they have, in this sense, no choice. It is their function to overshadow and awaken mind in a subsequent humanity. And then again, there are those who are the failures. And here is another whole facet to this. I mean, were it not for this passage which talks of failures, and failure we have mentioned previously too, you might have got the whole process, well, it doesn't really matter, we'll get there sooner or later. Whether we get the spark now, whether we get it later, whether they defer till the fourth rays, well, does it really matter? Well, in a number of places, the fact that evolution and development is contingent on effort, and the requisite effort is stressed, and we've mentioned this in the Mahatma letters. And this particular passage, which was originally quoted in the Mahatma letters and is subsequently repeated in the Secret Doctrine, and in two places, I might say, so presumably it's of some considerable importance, again talks of this possibility of failures. Not only possibility, necessity. The very first sentence, now there must be failures in the ethereal races of the many classes of Dahan Chohans. There is no certainty in this process. Now, who are these failures? Well, it seems that these are those who fail to graduate, to put it at its simplest. Suppose that we follow through our cyclic evolution and that we follow our evolution through the subsequent rounds. Suppose when we get to the seventh round, we haven't succeeded. supposing that fire is not self-sustaining, well, what's to be done with us, you might say? It's rather like like politicians. You've either said too little or too much. What are we to do with you now? We have undergone some development as self-conscious entities, and that experience cannot now just be dismissed. We cannot just throw it away. We are not the laggards in whom no mind was ever awakened. We are not the graduate humanity who has fully succeeded in awakening mind and are candidates for Manasaputras in some other age, but we sort of flunked out halfway along the line and didn't quite make it. So, it's, when you read this passage, you begin to think, perhaps I'll try a little harder. Now, there must be failures in the ethereal races of the many classes of Dayan Chohans or Devas. And just as a very short aside, be warned, in the Mahatma letters they use this term Devas very loosely. And many theosophists who have been brought up on the Besant Leadbeater might leap off and think, Devas, yes, parallel lines of evolution, not men, but become Devas. Not a bit of it. They just use the term Deva, a luminous being, literally, as a term synonymous with Dayan Chohan. I see no difference. So it's not two classes here, but two names for the same class. Many classes of Dayan Chohans or Devas. But still, as these failures are too far progressed, in other words, they're already, to a degree, self-conscious entities, and spiritualized, too far progressed to be thrown back forcibly from their Dayan Chohanship into the vortex of a new primordial evolution through the lower kingdoms. They can't just go back to being minerals, plants, and animals all over again. This then happens when a new solar system is to be evolved, and this again, there is further insight as a result of the passage that Joy read us out this morning. It's not until the development of a new solar system that their fate catches up with them. They are the failed graduates, or whatever they would be, the flunkies of a previous humanity, and now their fate catches up with them. When a new solar system is to be evolved, these Dayan Chohans are born in by the influx ahead of the elementals. Now remember, this is the whole sequence, you remember, of the seven kingdoms arriving around the Laya centre of the new globe to build the new form. So ahead, in inverted commas here, I think means that they are within the area or aura of the new to-be-formed globe. They are one of the ingredients even before the elementals start their work. Ahead of the elementals, and remain as a latent or inactive spiritual force in the aura of the nascent globe world, nascent to be born, until the stage of human evolution is reached. Well, that's going to be a long time, isn't it? An awful long time. 3.5 rounds they've had to wait. And is reached. Then karma has reached them, and they will have to accept it to the last drop in the bitter cup of retribution. That doesn't sound too tasty, does it? Bitter cups of retribution, not my cup of tea, to mix the metaphor, but perhaps this is something that we should aim to avoid if we can. Don't fancy bitter cups of retribution much. They will become an active force and commingle with the elementals or progressed entities of the pure animal kingdom to develop little by little the full type of humanity. So they have to become involved in this whole process, infused into the whole human process, you might say. In this commingling, in this mixing together, they lose their high intelligence and spirituality of devaship. In other words, whatever they might have won, although they didn't graduate, they still won quite a bit. And whatever it is that they've won, they now lose for the time being. Can you imagine that? Losing all of that in order to have to leaven the mass, to regain them at the end of the 7th ring in the 7th round, right at the whole end of the cycle. Then they will emerge from that whole process and presumably have graduated from it in turn.
Time periods involved are immense.
Mm.
You can get another solar system after this.
Mm.
This one's got to peter out. We've got
Yeah.
to finish our 7 rounds.
Yeah,
Oh,
and a
right.
bit more besides, because there's nothing said about how many more planetary chains there might be yet to go within our solar manvantara. Then through the whole of the next solar pralaya, then wait for a new humanity to
The
emerge.
scale of it is
Mm.
unimaginable.
Mm. Mm.
Are they likely to be conscious of timing? Or
Presumably not, though no clocks in our sense of it, but they will be, in some of these states at least, conscious. What the content of their consciousness is never indicated.
But in a way, it's a lesson to us here and now, isn't it? If we get a sparkle of insight
Mm.
and we don't hold it, we
Right.
let it go, we let it fade away and don't treat it with
Mm.
reverence.
We have it all to
If
do.
we don't use it, we lose it.
Right.
And it may be comparatively in our lives eons before
Mm.
we can get another sparkle.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then you've got to do all the work
That's right.
all over again.
Well, you've lost what you had
Yeah.
and more.
To regain it. Yes.
It happens with us all the time.
Yes, it does. Mm. Mm.
Starting ahead. The mountains higher next time.
Yeah, yes, it is. They do say that, don't they? That with each failure, you have to make a greater effort the next time to achieve just the same step.
Not fair.
The carrot and stick treatment, isn't it?
We might be on the second time round now.
How will you complain?
Compared to what we might have had.
Yeah, tell him. Ask him that.
Just one last thought for this evening, or this afternoon, on this on this area. Draw your attention to the note that I've put on page 126. One of the fundamental mistakes, it seems to me, that was made in subsequent theosophical literature was when talking of these beings, who in the stanzas are referred to in one place as the Lords of the Flame. One of the many terms used is the Lords of the Flame. Well, in the Besant and Deadbeater literature, these Lords of the Flame were supposed to have come from Venus and to have animated and overshadowed man and da-da-da-da. Well, quite apart from the whole different flavour that you get in the description given of these beings who remain in their own nature and never really get involved in, get their hands dirty, so to speak, in this process of incarnation, as you see here in what we've been studying, but they're also said to have come from Venus. Now, in no sense, as you can now see, could they have possibly come from Venus in any sense of the word. Either they're returning Nirvanis from a previous Mahamanvantara, haven't been anywhere near Venus, or they're Nirmanakayas from a previous system, haven't been anywhere near Venus, or they're failures from a previous system who've been lying asleep in the aura of this globe all through the previous round, haven't been anywhere near Venus, and it's those who have awoken mind in man. So where they got this idea that they, in some sense, came from Venus beats me. I have put in there a little note showing that there is indeed a relationship with Venus as a sacred planet, and as each sacred planet is associated with one of the principles, and as it happens, Venus is associated with our fifth principle, or mind, perhaps that's where the basis of the confusion came in. But if you see any of these descriptions about Lords of the Flame coming from Venus, remember what you have read in the secret doctrine.
So no beets, no eggs,
No bees, no, I'm sorry, no wheat brought from
wheat.
Venus, no, none of these fairy
How
stories,
you
I'm
like
sorry. No, we shall have to do without the fairy stories, I'm afraid.
Yeah.
So that's enough, I think, for one day.